So, hello everybody. My name is Deasún and I'm from Scattework. I'm sitting in Switzerland, which is where our business is run from. And we've been kindly invited by the Project Management Institute in Austria to present this webinar. And the title is How to Manage Your Project Stakeholders Remotely. And I think this is a good title because stakeholders are the people that we work with in a project. And if we don't get that right, nothing works. So stakeholders are really the center of project. Now you should see now that it's gone onto the second screen, which is the summary, and that's what's on the website. So that's just there for completeness. And during the program, there'll be plenty of opportunity to interact with us. If you can turn on your microphones, that would be good, or sending chat. And at the end, we'll also have a question and answer session. So I'm delighted to say that my colleague here is Dr. Zorana Boltić, and she is president of PMI Serbia Chapter. So it's a great honor for us for her to be associated with us in this. And in fact, I have a global role as well in PMI, and I've had 2 or 3 different ones over the last 10 years or so. And I was also on the board of PMI Switzerland, and all the rest you can read later or check us on LinkedIn. So the organization we've been running, the company itself has been running since 2008. And as you can see from the blue areas on the map, we've been in quite a lot of countries, mostly North America, Europe and Asia, and right over to New Zealand. South America, we've had clients, but we haven't physically been there, but we've managed programs there, and a handful in Africa as well. And there are some of the logos of companies that we've worked with. And we work across sectors, but basically the sectors tend to be technical in nature. So I wanted to move on now to the actual agenda of the program, and to say that we've got 4 particular comments here, and we're going to go through each of those, exploring them, particularly for stakeholders that are at a distance. And then at the end, we'll consolidate them. As I say, we take questions and answers, but you can also make your comments as we go through. So, Zorana, I pass over to you now.
I'm not sure if I can control the slides. Oh,
yeah, I control the slides. There you go.
Okay. Hi, everybody from my side. I think since this is a small group of participants, I think it is maybe value added to enable communication while we speak. Of course, there will be in a Q&A section at the end, and Sandra and Faiz are taking care of that. And you can type in your questions in the chat, in the Q&A section all the time. But please, in case you're not able to unmute yourself, just raise your hand. I think you have this option on the right side of your screen to raise your hand. I suppose you can all see it. Maybe you can try it. Raise hand. It's on the right at the bottom. Yeah, it's working. Ursula, I saw her hand. So if you could just try it to see if it works. Yeah. Yes, great. Donna as well. Claudia, yes, good. So I think if you are not able to unmute yourself, this is an option for communication. Just raise your hand, and Sandra will unmute you, and you can ask questions, and we can discuss while we speak, because I think this is more convenient than waiting till the end, since this is a small group of people. So anyway, just this like an introduction. I suppose you all familiar with stakeholders and what they are, but just to go through this quickly. These are the people. Sometimes we perceive our stakeholders as the ones who are directly involved in the project. But I would like to emphasize that stakeholders are much broader than that. And of course, this is management who give us assignment and authorize the resources to deliver a project. But then again, these are also company functions, like maybe shadow sponsors, because in the functional organizations, very often a project manager is not authorized to manage the resources, but somebody else has the ownership of the resources. And it is very important for project managers to be able to negotiate the resources they need for their project. I suppose you have been in those situations very often, to be in a position to have these company functional managers as very important stakeholders, as they are the one who are to give you the resources to deliver your projects. And then again, these are not only stakeholders who are collocated or work in the same organization as we do. Very often those stakeholders are our suppliers, different regulatory bodies, the authorities that we need to consider depending on the type of project, and of course of customers, who can be internal customers but also external customers. So this is very important to think about these types of stakeholders when we are speaking about distant stakeholders and the stakeholders we need to manage remotely. So these are the stakeholders we will be focusing most. So Deasún, if you could please go to the next slide. And they all interact between themselves, and all those interactions have to be managed, because it is not only our boss or our sponsor that has to be satisfied with the project deliveries and the project results, but because very often we are focused to on our key stakeholders to be satisfied and to meet their expectations. But nevertheless, the success of our projects can strongly depend on the satisfaction and the expectations and meeting the expectations of various distant stakeholders who very often get neglected during the project and during the managing their interactions. So this is also what we are going to be focusing on in this webinar. So if you can please go to the next slide. And then again, very often we follow the rules and we follow the processes as per the PMBOK guide, which I'm going to mention again on the next slides. But sometimes when we are very much into our work and trying to follow the procedures, we often the purpose. So it's not just that you need the list of stakeholders just to comply with the requirements of the methodology, but more important, you need to think about why you need those stakeholders and why do we actually need to identify them at the very beginning of our project. So stakeholders are there for us to discover all the project requirements in order to be able to develop our scope, because it is not possible even to start planning without identifying all the stakeholders, because we plan based on our requirements. Then again, when developing solutions, sustainable solutions, it is of a huge value to involve all our stakeholders to be able to develop, to come up with sustainable solutions, because all the ideas can come from our stakeholders. And of course, sometimes in my experience, very often, many companies and many project managers and project teams are not paying enough attention on risk management processes. And in risk management processes, I believe that stakeholders' involvement is the key, because it is not possible for us to uncover and identify all the risks. It is crucial that we discover those risks using the communication with our stakeholders, because these are the ones who know best. And of course, when talking about risk management, stakeholder tolerance is also of utmost importance, because when we develop our strategy, mitigation strategies and strategies on how to deal with risks, we need to take care about the tolerance of our stakeholders. So this is also why we need our stakeholders for that. Okay, so yes. So who are the stakeholders? So basically, these are not only the people who are involved or the people who are by default or people who are even interested in our project. These are all the people or organizations or groups that can impact the result of our project or that can get impacted by what we want to deliver by our project. And why it is also important, because by definition, and you know that communication is the key for successful project managers, and all the communication go through the stakeholders. So in order to develop communication strategies and good communication plan, it is also very important to be aware of who our stakeholders are. So if you would go to the next one. And then I would like you to think about all different approaches that you're currently using on your project, because project PMI methodology is now also transforming, and PMI is transforming its own approach to its stakeholders and embracing all the different approaches that might be used to reach the outcomes. So this slide is just for you to remember that stakeholders and stakeholder management is relevant, whatever methodology you are using and whatever approach you are currently applying to manage your project. So if you have any ideas or questions at this point, or maybe if you would like to share with us which particular methodology are you using on your project, and which approach is something that you are most familiar with, and with which you have more experience, you can type it in the Q&A section and we can discuss. So if we can move forward. Yes. So whatever project methodology and the specific approach that you are using, I wanted just to remind you that PMI Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide can always be perceived as relevant. And as I said before, although the focus is constantly changing, especially due to the disruptive environments and in the context of changing technology and always changing the way we work together now more than ever, then although that is the situation, PMI is still relevant, and it can always be perceived as a compendium of observed real-world project practice and a valuable checklist of topics based on decades of inputs and from thousands of project managers globally applying all technologies. So this is just because Donna has a question, I think. Donna, is it the hand from before, or do you want to say something? Donna? You can speak if you want, because you're unmuted, so.
No, something fell on the keyboard. Nothing.
Sorry?
Something fell on the keyboard. It's nothing.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, well, it's just, I don't know whether you are aware, you are all members of PMI, and the PMI is currently transforming, and it's transforming its strategy, especially in order to adapt to this change in environment and the change role of project manager and how the profession has been perceived. But what I'm saying is that still the PMBOK guide is relevant, and that you can always use it, maybe as something that is written in stone, but always to use it as a valuable toolkit for the processes and the approaches that you can just take out and use depending on your needs and depending on the needs of your project. So if you could please go to the next slide. This is just a reminder, because still PMBOK guide, especially this version 6, is organized by process groups, and as you are all aware of, the first process group is initiating process group, and there are only 2 processes in this initiating process group, and this is develop project charter and identify stakeholders, and this is what we are going to talk about today, and especially from the perspective of managing those remote stakeholders, managing them remotely. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are remote physically, but Deasún will tell you more about how we can perceive the distance of our stakeholders and which are the different aspects that we need to consider when talking about remote stakeholders. So if you can go just to the next, because before we go there, I wanted also to emphasize this change perspective also of the PMI and the PMBOK guide that is to come, the next version. And beside embracing different approaches to delivering outcomes, then this PMI is looking to align knowledge domains to real life practices. And the focus is moving from the process groups towards these three areas. And these are people, process, and business environments. So the focus is shifting to people versus technical approach to processes, and these people are actually our stakeholders. And I want to recommend the book. So if you could click just Deasún, this is a very interesting book about stakeholders management, and it is just testing this idea that we can very often, when working on the projects, we sort of start to think that all these people are there because we need to deliver a project. But this book is testing a counter situation where projects are there for people and not people are not there for projects. So this is the perspective I would like to share with you, and this is how we are going to approach this topic of stakeholders management. So Deasún, if you could, yeah. So the first thing and the tip number one is find out who all your stakeholders are, even before you define your project, even when it is on the level of the initiative. It is the first thing to think about who the stakeholders are, because the project is going to be initiated because of them and not vice versa.
Great, thanks very much for that. I can't see the list of who's online, but Zorana, maybe can you tell me, is there anyone who wanted to make a comment or put up their hand or write a text or anything just before I move on?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, well, we move forward. So I'm going to take over there and talk about this next thing and ask what influences the stakeholders, because it's not good enough just to know who the people are, because people are people, so they all react in different ways depending on their environment and their background and culture and all the rest of it. So just having a list of who they are is not good enough. In fact, I've been in companies that have asked me, are we allowed to write down the list of stakeholders? And the obvious answer is yes. How can you possibly manage them if you don't write down at least a list? And then think about each person. This person is familiar with this person is less familiar, this person has a different technology, or this person has a particular emphasis or whatever. So in this webinar, we're looking at remote stakeholders. And being remote means being far away. And as Zorana said, there are different ways of being far away. So one of them is geographical. So most of you are probably in Austria, although I believe we have 1 or 2 visitors, so I welcome you as well. And we're all somewhere in Europe. But for example, if we have work with a company in China, then the people there, they're geographically remote. And then they could be culturally remote. So if I take the example of China, for most of us Europeans, I just take that as an example. If we're dealing, for example, with Americans, they're not quite as sort of remote as, say, Chinese or something like that, because of the history and the way that Europe sent a lot of people to America and familiarity with American television and films and all the rest of it. So although they're quite far away, the cultural distance is not so far. And then you have the organizational one. So you might have 2 divisions of the same company, and they may have very, very different leaders with different styles, and they might be in different geographical areas, and they might say, you're not allowed to use our rooms or something like that. So you can get remoteness like that as well. And the point I've got at the bottom there is that the stakeholders are influenced by local demands. So we're doing our project, we're trying to make something happen. And actually, what we want them to do is quite low on their list of priorities, because they will be dominated by what happens locally. So somebody comes in and says, oh, we have a birthday today and we're going for a drink before we go home. They will drop your work. It doesn't matter what they told you, they will go with the group. So that the local influences are very strong. So I see a comment coming up there about cultural differences, and that's very definitely, there's a specific a couple of tools that I'm going to mention that we have slides for. So the local boss has more influence. So if you're the project manager and you think somebody is in your team, the local boss of that person probably dominates, in my experience. And if they move away and do something else, the boss says, look, I just need you for an hour or two to do something. By doing that, they're not on your project. And then if it's a Friday, for example, your thing doesn't finish, and then it runs over to next week for the sake of an hour. You know? So that's part of the scenario that we have there. So the next few slides I can run through quickly, but they're there for reference. So you can be physical and culturally remote. So far away stakeholders are remote. But if you look at the bottom of that slide there, people in the same organization or in the same country, or, you know, in closely related countries, say like Austria is near Germany, for example, are closer than, let us say, Italy and Turkey, just to take an example. And then here are some stakeholders that are very often quite remote. Suppliers and their employees, they're not even in the organization, and they leave their stuff at the door, and nobody invites them to the party, and they don't really know what it's happening about. And they may be in a completely different country and with different culture and so on. And then you have local services, which you have no control over. So shall we say a courier company? They're very critical. I was on a project once in Belgium, and we were delivering a computer to Hungary, and it went to a courier, and for about a week we didn't even know what country the computer was in. You know, so that was a case where the courier was remote, you know, even though geographically they weren't, and so on. And then remote with good communication, I've got example there, can be suppliers, but in-company services. For example, you may have an HR department that operates globally, and the HR people all know each other. So although they're not very close, they're organizationally close. And at the bottom of that page, your own team members in the same organization, they will be close. Dotted line managers can be quite close if they're near you, but sometimes the dotted line manager is in a different division or something like that. And direct reports, of course, are very close. So that's just to stimulate that thinking. But what I want to do is to come on to the question of particular tips for dealing. And this is the first of two particular things I want to show you. One of them is that we have everything that we deal with, everything that stakeholders, we assume they're the same as us. That was the way it was done traditionally. We all used the same money. We all had lunch at the same time. We all had the same telephone codes. We all spoke the same language, and so on and so on. And the more remote people are, the more of those things are different. So, for example, let's just take the left-hand side there. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but let's just take alphabet. We often run up against that. I mean, obviously, even in our team, we're using two alphabets. And then you get accents on alphabets, and you get different keyboards and all that sort of stuff. Another one that comes like that is paper size. I mean, in America, they have a particular paper sizes, and most of us, we have these A sizes. So you get a document in Word from America and you can't print it. Or if you do, it upsets all the page numbering and so on. So those are sort of differences. We could ask, where are the diversity? And you can see a lot there that I put: working hours, time the weekend starts, what day of the week you have the weekend, and so on and so on. I was talking to somebody in America recently, and I said, please call me. And she said, I can't, it's international. And I said, well, why don't you use the international dialing code? And she had never heard of it. You know, so those are the sort of situations. Let me stop for a moment in case any of you can add to that list or have experiences of unexpected diversity. Can you see that, Zorana? Is anyone showing up?
No, I don't see
Okay.
any hands.
Okay. I'll give you
I
one.
don't see the chat or the Q&A, so I don't
Okay.
see the questions.
I give you one I had, and then I'll move on. I was delivering a program in Vienna. In fact, I was in Vienna quite a lot over the years, but this particular program, the company had people from Vienna, and it also had people from Hungary. And it was a Friday. And it happened that the people in Vienna finished the working week at 1 o'clock, and the people in Hungary finished at 6 o'clock. So what actually happened on Friday, half the people present just disappeared. You know, and you're only, what, 100 kilometers away. So those sort of things happen. Okay, so let's move on. So the next thing, as I say, the summary tip there is identify what influence your stakeholders. You know, is it politics? Is it money? Is it climate? You're dealing with Australia. It's summer here, it's winter there, and so on. You don't know. But there can be dozens of little things, and the further away they are, the more of those things come. Okay, the next thing is this question that was raised about the culture of the stakeholders. And I'm putting up a thing here that is well known and it's been around for a long time, but I find it very, very useful for project managers. So if you've already come across this, I apologize, but whether or not you have, I find it's very useful to think about it. And this Hofstede, I believe he's Dutch, what he did, he was looking for some sort of measure, cultural measure of how close countries are. And he came up with these 6 indices. And I just talk about them in generic terms. You can look, there's a link there, you can look him up and you'll find him easily. But one of them is power distance. So I give you an example. If you're in Paris and the president drives past, they probably block the street and the police motorbikes go through. And then when they're going through, you get a fast car drives through and in it is the president. That's France. I live in Switzerland. A couple of years ago, I was at the tram stop in Bern, which is where the parliament is. And next to me in the tram stop was the president of Switzerland going home for lunch. You get the difference. So in one country, the power distance is very high. You don't get anywhere near the people with power. And in the other country, they're literally beside you physically. And that index varies by country. So if you have stakeholders that are in one culture and you're in the other, unless you think about it, you might miss that. Now, a second one here is individual versus collective. And I don't want to sort of pick countries and say they're very obvious that, but generally speaking, people would think of people in the United States as being very individualistic. I mean, some other countries, I was in Singapore and I was at a dinner after an event. And the lady next to me started feeding me with a spoon. And I thought, oh, what's happening here? And she said, oh, well, in our culture, we look after the elderly people. And she said if her father were there, she would have fed him with a spoon. So that was a very collective sort of action. Very, very different. You wouldn't get that in America. Certainly not. Masculine versus feminine. And the 2 examples that you often get there is that, shall we say, Sweden tends to be very non-masculine, it's sort of neutral almost in some ways, but Australia, they always say it's very sort of man-oriented. Uncertainty avoidance, I can give you 2 countries there. Where I come from, I'm Irish, and in Ireland we live with uncertainty. You know, you don't know what you're going to have for dinner, and you don't know what country you're going to be living in next week, and nobody minds. But here in Switzerland, where I live, everything is insured, everything. You know, and if the train arrives 3 minutes late, they think, well, that's very uncertain. You know, so that's another index. Long-term versus short-term, you can see. Some people plan, and Japan plans very much long-term, as I think a lot of people would recognize what they do, they make decisions, and others do it for short. And then indulgence versus restraint. What that means is, do I get a quick payback because I do something now, or do I sort of invest my time and effort so I get a better payback? Now, those are the 6 dimensions that he has. And on his website, you can go in and you can click on countries and compare them. And I'm going to, what I've done here is I've picked out Austria, United Arab Emirates with Dubai and so on, Singapore, and the United States. And if you look across here, what I find is interesting, I was quite surprised at this, and maybe somebody could make a comment, but that the power distance for Austria is much lower. In Dubai, for example, you know, they have a kingdom and all that. So, you know, the person at the top is very untouchable. And the Hofstede is coming up with a very low score for Austria. I don't know if anyone has a comment, or Zorana, you know Austria as well.
Yes, I suppose I didn't explore this further. But I suppose in Europe in general, compared to the other countries you have here, Singapore and Arab Emirates and even United States, I think in general the power distance index in Western Europe is quite low compared to the Eastern Europe.
I think that's fair. So the point about this for project managers is that if you've got a project, you can go into this website, you click on the countries that you have part of your project happening in, and then you look at those graphs and you say, does that make sense, or do I need to do something? So if you take this individualism thing, for example, if you were, shall we say, in Austria and you're dealing with United States, then clearly there's a very big difference, and somehow this is going to affect how the stakeholders operate. So it's a very, very good thing, and he's updated it over the years. So I strongly recommend that you click on that, you pick out the countries you're dealing with, and you use that with the checklist I gave you earlier. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So obviously you can have variations within corporate cultures at different company level. I'll give you an example. I was a student in Scotland, and I had a friend and he got a holiday job, and the company he worked in had 12 levels of restaurants. And the lowest level was the guy who opened the door or swept the floor. And the top level was the managing director who sat on his own. And he didn't even sit with his own team for lunch. They had 12 levels. I mean, huge. And then there will be other societies where that doesn't apply. Then, of course, you've got religious things. And we all know about differences between Europe and Asia and Muslims and Christians and all the rest of it. So, you know, where people like us were almost certainly familiar with that without spending time. And also age and gender. For example, they say, I mean, I'm in the older group, okay? But when I started working on the telephone list, they had names like Murphy and O'Sullivan. Huh? And if that person was important, they had their first name as well. So if it said Sean O'Sullivan, you knew he was important. But if it just said O'Sullivan, he wasn't important. You know, now you can't imagine that now, and younger people would just go to anyone and talk to them and so on. So, a couple of comments here. Zorana.
Yeah, at the end of this section, just a few tips on the culture, because I had to learn it the hard way, because for years I was working for an international company who had 3 regions, like Western Europe, Balkans, like Southeast Europe, and Russia. So these are completely different cultures, and when you are working in an environment like this, especially in companies like this, all the global projects are always multicultural, and you will have people participating from different countries and definitely different cultures. So it is not something to be neglected, because it can be source of many misunderstandings between people, because very often you assume that your colleagues and your team are thinking the same way about the issues, and that they have the same understanding of what you are trying to do and what you are saying, but it is not true. And then you always need, in situations like this, you always need to get in somebody else's shoes and see things with his own eyes and from his own perspective, in order to be able to understand him properly, and in order to be able to understand where he's coming from, and then adapt communication based on that. And for that, it is very important to develop your own personal cultural competence, because it's a special competence, and you need to know yourself and the others, and you need to be ready to adapt, but without losing your own cultural identity, because this is not something that is desirable. And you should always also try to avoid the pitfalls, because sometimes we go to to the other end, and very often we sometimes interpret someone's behavior as caused by culture, but this is also not true, because many behaviors can originate from different sources. It's not always the culture if somebody is from a different culture. And another tip is, in these misunderstanding, it is always very efficient to use your sense of humor to resolve these the misunderstandings or even the conflicts. And of course, it is always easier when you are collocated and when you have people in the room. Then it's easier to overcome all these differences. It is a much bigger challenge. So Deasún, if you could click just on the animation, it is a bigger challenge when you need to manage those stakeholders remotely, because you are all very often lacking important aspects of communication, because as you all know, an important aspect of communication is also the body language, and people are able to see you and feel the way you are addressing them. And it is challenging when you need to communicate virtually, like what we are doing now. It's quite awkward. It's much different from the situation where we would be in the same room and where I would be able to see your reactions and maybe an interest to ask a question, So it's much challenging, and it's harder. And this is in particular the reason while even these days you should put more effort into developing those competencies and use them regularly.
Very good. So I've got a couple of cases here that I'm going to talk about where cultural misunderstandings were part of the scenario. This was one that I was on a project. It was being manufactured in Canada and it was being sent to France, and it was tested in Canada and it was okay, and they sent it and it kept getting rejected in France. It wasn't released. And it was a big order. It was 10 million or something euro. I mean, it was big. And nobody could find out what the problem was. And they had exactly that problem that Zorana just said. They were all in different places and they were communicating by email and different time zones and so on. And they just couldn't solve it. You can't solve problems when you have poor communication like that. So what they eventually decided to do was to sort of get a team working on it, and they would travel around and visit people and so on and try and find out what the problem was. Okay. And what they found out was that the product did meet the specification. And they wrote that down on a page which said the product is okay. But on the same page, there was some other confidential information. So they didn't want to release the page. The product was okay, but the page wasn't. And the reason it ran, or one of the contributory reasons, is the thing at the bottom of the screen there, that the Canadians didn't expect such an authoritarian approach. For example, if the product was good, the Canadians expected, well, if the paperwork isn't correct, you redesign the paperwork and you release the product. But in France is one of these very hierarchical countries. As somebody said to me, it's like they never had the revolution. And and part of the country I live in, they have a lot of contact with France. And if the boss says this is the bit of paper, then they use it, even if it overrides the sensitive. So had they had that, they probably have resolved the issue more easily if they had identified that part of the problem was cultural. What do you do with paper? I can give you another example while I'm there. It's not on the screen, but it was a group here in Switzerland, and they ordered books. It was to do with PMI. They ordered books from America, and the books were not delivered. And everyone went wild. And anyway, what actually happened is this. In America, when you buy a book, you go on Amazon, you pay your money with a credit card, and then they send you the book. In Switzerland, you go on the website, you order your book, they send it to you, you get an invoice and you pay it a month later. So from the Swiss viewpoint, they had ordered the book because they said, please send us the book, but they didn't get them. Because from the American side, they said, you haven't ordered it because you haven't paid the money. And it blew up when there was a public holiday in America, and I was in Germany and got mails from everywhere. And so those things, that was a cultural issue, definitely. So the tip there is recognize the culture of your stakeholders. And as Zorana said, you need to learn those things both for yourself and for the other people as well. And the last bit here is communicating with the stakeholders. And I'm going to try to go fast as I can reasonably. So the first thing here is, Zorana, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, just a few bits, and we need to take care of the time as well.
Yes.
As said before, first of all, it is important to identify all your stakeholders, whether they're inside or outside your organization. And this is not just for the sake of identification, but in order to develop the adequate strategies to be able to deal with them, especially with the ones that always get neglected. And these are probably the less powerful ones, but the ones that your project results are most affecting on them. So it very often happens that those get neglected because they have less power, and those are the employees, the users, the public, depending on the project, the community. So on the next slide, another tip is that one of the ways to engage your stakeholders, and especially the ones that are key stakeholders and that ultimately decide on the success of your project, is to constantly review the requirements and the expectation with them. And this is basically important because you need to adapt your strategies, your communication strategies, to avoid their dissatisfaction. And another thing I would like to share on the next slide is that here, especially, you need, when it comes to communication, you need to consider different aspects of virtual communication. And this is something that we are more and more getting used to now because of this crisis, and we were forced to learn things that we might have not needed before. And I just wanted to share some important things that you need to think about when it comes to virtual communication and virtual management of your teams. You need to take care about the norms, your appearance, and the use of technology, because even preparing for this particular webinar, there are always issues because different people have different expectations from the technology and different experience in using this technology. So you can't assume that other people and people in your team have the same level of proficiency when using the technology that you are using. So this is something you need to take care of, and that you need to be patient with your knowledge and share your experience with others in order for the whole team to be able to achieve its maximum when using those tools and using the technology. And also, I think there is a huge difference between face-to-face and virtual communication, virtual meetings. And these are a couple of things that need to be considered when switching from face-to-face to virtual. And this is mostly attention span. And this is what worries me most, even when delivering this webinar, because the attention span on the online communication is much shorter than face-to-face, because the variety provokes the attention. And when you are in the room with people, there are a lot of stimuli around us, creating this variety and making us pay attention to what other people are speaking about. And when you are doing this online, this attention span is much shorter. So you need to think about how to engage the others who are participating in an event or the meeting or whatever you are communicating with your stakeholders. Then you are when communicating online in a virtual environment, it's harder to read the emotions because some aspects of communication are lacking. Yes, of course. For example, now you can hear me, you can hear what I'm saying, and you can hear my pitch and tone of voice and see my body language, which is close to ideal, but still not ideal, since I'm not able to see you, you know, and I'm not able to I have no idea at the moment how you feel about this and how you are perceiving this webinar that we are delivering. And then, of course, the contents, and this is something you also need to take care, because the contents that you are communicating is different when you communicate orally, face-to-face, or in using different tools and different technology. So Deasún, if you could take from here.
So here's another tip that I find works very well, is that to explain things to people as if they are a story. I'm talking about stakeholders. You want them to understand. And a stupid example I heard was that a butcher put bones on the counter and it said bones for the dog, and nobody took the bones. And he asked somebody and he said, what's wrong? They're there. And somebody said, well, we don't know if they're free. And he said, well, obviously they're free. But anyway, they put the word free and then everyone took the bones. So the point is that you have to interact with people and fill in their detail. So if you ever ask the way, you're in a city and you ask the way and they say, well, after you pass such and such a shop, you know, you go right. But your question is, how do I get to that shop? You have to follow the route with them. And so this means that the order in which you give the information is important. It's not good enough just to say, well, I sent you a screenshot, or, you know, here's the dossier or something like that. You have to explain it. And I always say it's a bit like a fairy story. You know, you start at the top, you say, long ago there was a king and the king lived in a castle and he had a beautiful daughter and so on, you know, but you go down the chain. You don't start by going in and saying what they had for breakfast. You have to go somehow put it in place. So this idea, and storytelling, it's quite strongly emphasized in the agile world, by the way. And it's also very important in projects because you have to get the resources. You have to explain to the stakeholders that have the money or the people. And if they don't understand, well, then you have a problem. So talking to them in story, this is why we're doing it, because, you know, if we don't, this and this happens and so on, is a much better way than just giving the information sort of all at once. So that's one suggestion there. Another one here, this is a tip again, is that when you want people to interact with you, you tell them the impact. So instead of saying we're under pressure, Zorana would say to me, you've only got 4 minutes left. You know, it's much easier for me to interact with a measure than it is to interact with a general comment about resources. So if you want people to interact, try and put it in some measurable resource, so that they're more likely to interact. I do this one very quickly. This was a situation, we were setting up a mobile phone network in Switzerland, and we had, my manager got thrown out. And the reason was that the rollout was very slow. And the obvious reason was that in every location, people were against having antennas. They wanted mobile phones, but they didn't want antennas. And in one block, a lady, she got headaches because of the antenna. So she went on television and she said, oh, you know, ever since they put that antenna on the roof, I have headaches. So we sent out an engineer to check it, and there wasn't even a cable connected to it, no electricity, nothing. But because she went on television, she blocked the rollout, and my boss got thrown out, and part of it was that particular incident. And so the cultural comment here is that she was remote in the sense that she was outside the organization. And nobody thought to communicate with her. And Zorana has already said, you need to find out everybody, not nearly everybody, but everybody. And this one here was a case in point. So communicate personally with your stakeholders. And an added thing there about the virtual environment is if you get any chance at all to deal with them personally, you know, that they're in your head office and you're there, take them out for lunch and so on, all that sort of stuff, which will make it easier later. So those are our 4 tips here. Find out who all your stakeholders are. Identify what influences them. They're probably in a different culture, environment, all that sort of stuff. recognize their culture, which may be a mixture of this national and thing, but more, we've heard that before, but I would be much more focused and say, what's specific in their environment do we need to recognize that may cause a bit of a problem? And then communicate personally with people. It probably, if you have problems with stakeholders, probably, and they're far away, probably the most useful thing is a telephone, you know. So that's where we got to the, now we've run out of time. We had a little bit of techie problems at the beginning, but I'm going to hand back to Faiz, and you can decide if you want it to go longer and there are lots of questions, we'd love to do it for a few minutes. But I'd just like to say thank you for the invitation and hand back to see if there's any questions or answers or comments.
Thank you, Deasún. I had one question. How does matrix management affect stakeholder management from your experience?
If I come in, that matrix management is an old trick. You know, you have a factory and you want everybody to work all the time. So you give them all a manager. So they all have a, you know, production manager or an accounting manager or whatever. And then you want to do a project, but you need skills from different departments. So you send out the project manager, and we've all seen that in the PM book, this thing about weak and strong matrices. Huh? But the point, in that circumstance, you've got two stakeholders usually, not only the person, but both of the bosses. And one of the bosses may want to go on holiday in June, and the other boss may want to move their office when this new building is finished. They're completely different things. So I think matrix management increases the chances of there being different interests. And in a way, it's a sort of an example of this issue that we're talking about today of, you know, remote, because one of those managers is more remote than the other usually. Zorana, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I lived with that all my life, my professional life, because I always had one boss in Germany and one in Serbia, and it was very hard. I think that in the in any organization, because the organizational structure is considered in PMI as an enterprise environmental factor. So by definition, this is something we cannot influence much. But nevertheless, it is of utmost importance that we are very aware of the real organizational structure that we are operating in, so that we understand as project managers which is the level of authority that we have when managing the projects and how to approach each of, because usually when you have two bosses, the level of power of both of them is not the same. And it depends whether it's a weak, strong or balanced matrix. So you need to consider this level of power, even not the formal power, but the real power in the organization, and to understand how to approach each of them in order to be able to work, to be successful as a project manager.
Okay, well, thank you, Deasún, and thank you, Zorana, for a very interesting presentation, and I found it very useful. Thank you all for attending and joining this webinar.